Good evening and welcome back to another episode of The Longing. Today we are going to be continuing to read The Sleeper Awakes by H.G. Wells. So, let's get going. The slightly greenish tint of the glass-like substance which surrounded him on every hand obscured what lay behind, but he perceived it was a vast apartment of splendid appearance, and with a very large and simple white archway facing him. Close to the walls of the cage were articles of furniture, a table covered with a silvery cloth, silvery like the side of a fish, a couple of graceful chairs, and on the table a number of dishes with substances piled on them, a bottle and 2 glasses. He realized that he was intensely hungry. He could see no one, and after a period of hesitation scrambled off the translucent mattress and tried to stand on the clean white floor of his little apartment. He had miscalculated his strength, however, and staggered and put his hand against the glass-like pane before him to steady himself. For a moment it resisted his hand, bending outward like a distended bladder. Then it broke with a slight report and vanished, a pricked bubble. He reeled out into the general space of the hall, greatly astonished. He caught at the table to save himself, knocking one of the glasses to the floor. It rang but did not break, and sat down in one of the armchairs. When he had a little recovered, he filled the remaining glass from the bottle and drank. A colourless liquid it was, but not water, with a pleasing faint aroma and taste, and a quality of immediate support and stimulus. He put down the vessel and looked about him. The apartment lost none of its size and magnificence now that the greenish transparency that had intervened was removed. The archway he saw led to a flight of steps, going downward without the intermediation of a door, to a spacious transverse passage. This passage ran between polished pillars of some white-veined substance of deep ultramarine, and along it came the sound of human movements and voices and a deep, undeviating, droning note. He sat, now fully awake, listening alertly, forgetting the viands of his attention. Then, with a shock, he remembered that he was naked, and casting about him for covering, saw a long black robe thrown on one of the chairs beside him. This he wrapped about him as he sat down again, trembling. His mind was still a surging perplexity. Clearly he had slept and had been removed in his sleep. But where, and who were those people, the distant crowd beyond the deep blue pillars? Boscastle? He poured out and partially drank another glass of the colourless fluid. What was this place? This place that to his senses seemed subtly quivering, like a thing alive. He looked about him at the clean and beautiful form of the apartment, unstained by ornament, and saw that the roof was broken in one place by a circular shaft full of light, and, as he looked, a steady sweeping shadow blotted it out and passed, and came again and passed. Beat, beat. That sweeping shadow had a note of its own in the subdued tumult that filled the air. He would have called out, but only a little sound came into his throat. Then he stood up and, with the uncertain steps of a drunkard, made his way towards the archway. He staggered down the steps, tripped on the corner of the black coat he had wrapped about himself, and saved himself by catching at one of the blue pillars. The passage ran down a cool vista of blue and purple, and ended remotely in a railed space like a balcony brightly lit, and projecting into a space of haze, a space like the interior of some gigantic building. Beyond and remote were vast and vague architectural forms. The tumult of voices rose now loud and clear, and on the balcony, and with their backs to him, gesticulating an apparently inanimated conversation, were 3 figures, richly dressed in loose and easy garments of bright, soft colourings. The noise of a great multitude of people poured up over the balcony, and once it seemed the top of a banner passed, and once some brightly coloured object, a pale blue cap or garment, thrown up into the air perhaps, flashed athwart the space and fell. The shouts sounded like English. There was a reiteration of Wake. He heard some indistinct shrill cry, and abruptly these three men began laughing. "Ha ha ha," laughed one, a red-haired man in a short purple robe. "When the sleeper wakes. When?" He turned his eyes full of merriment along the passage. His face changed, the whole man changed, became rigid. The other two turned swiftly at his exclamation and stood motionless. Their faces assumed an expression of consternation, an expression that deepened into awe. Suddenly, Graham's knees bent beneath him. His arm against the pillar collapsed limply. He staggered forward and fell upon his face. Chapter 4. The Sound of a Tumult. Graham's last impression before he fainted was of the ringing of bells. He learnt afterwards that he was insensible, hanging between life and death for the better part of an hour. When he recovered his senses, he was back on his translucent couch, and there was a stirring warmth at heart and throat. The dark apparatus, he perceived, had been removed from his arm, which was bandaged. The white framework was still about him, but the greenish transparent substance that had filled it was altogether gone. A man in a deep violet robe, one of those who had been on the balcony, was looking keenly into his face. Remote but insistent was a clamour of bells and confused sounds that suggested to his mind the picture of a great number of people shouting together. Something seemed to fall across this tumult. A door suddenly closed. Graham moved his head. "What does this all mean?" he said slowly. "Where am I?" He saw the red-haired man who had been first to discover him. A voice seemed to be asking what he had said, and was abruptly stilled. The man in violet answered in a soft voice, speaking English with a slightly foreign accent, or so at least it seemed to the sleeper's ears. "You are quite safe. You were brought hither from where you fell asleep. It is quite safe. You have been here some time, sleeping, in a trance." He said something further that Graham could not hear, and a little vial was handed across to him. Graham felt a cooling spray. A fragrant mist played over his forehead for a moment, and his sense of refreshment increased. He closed his eyes in satisfaction. "Better?" asked the man in violet, as Graham's eyes reopened. He was a pleasant-faced man of 30, perhaps, with a pointed flaxen beard and a clasp of gold at the neck of his violet robe. "Yes," said Graham. "You have been asleep some time, in a cataleptic trance. You have heard. Catalepsy? It may seem strange to you at first, but I can assure you everything is well." Graham did not answer, but these words served their reassuring purpose. His eyes went from face to face of the three people about him. They were regarding him strangely. He knew he ought to be somewhere in Cornwall, but he could not square these things with that impression. A matter that had been in his mind during his last waking moments at Boscastle recurred, a thing resolved upon and somehow neglected. He cleared his throat. "Have you wired my cousin?" he asked. "E. Warming, 27 Chancery Lane." They were all assiduous to hear, but he had to repeat it. "What an odd blur in his accent," whispered the red-haired man. "Wire, sir?" said the young man with the flaxen beard, evidently puzzled. "He means send an electric telegram," volunteered the third, a pleasant-faced youth of 19 or 20. The flaxen-bearded man gave a cry of comprehension. "How stupid of me! You may be sure everything shall be done, sir," he said to Graham. "I am afraid it would be difficult to wire to your cousin. He is not in London now. But don't trouble about arrangements yet. You have been asleep a very long time, and the important thing is to get over that, sir." Graham concluded that the word was sir, but this man pronounced it sire. I read it as sir because that's what it's spelt as. "Oh, said Graham, and became quiet. It was all very puzzling, but apparently these people in unfamiliar dress knew what they were about. Yet they were odd, and the room was odd. It seemed he was in some newly established place. He had a sudden flash of suspicion. Surely this wasn't some hall of public exhibition. If it was, he would give Warming a piece of his mind. But it scarcely had that character, and in a place of public exhibition he would not have discovered himself naked. Then, suddenly, quite abruptly, he realized what had happened. There was no perceptible interval of suspicion, no dawn to his knowledge. Abruptly, he knew that his trance had lasted for a vast interval. As if by some process of thought-reading, he interpreted the awe in the faces that peered into his. He looked at them strangely, full of intense emotion. It seemed they read his eyes. He framed his lips to speak, and could not. A queer impulse to hide his knowledge came into his mind almost at the moment of his discovery. He looked at his bare feet, regarding them silently. His impulse to speak passed. He was trembling exceedingly. And with that, we have come to the end of the episode, and I may have lost track of time a little, but that's all good. So, I will say thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, or night. No matter what time of day it is, I hope you all have a wonderful one of it. And as always, we will be back tomorrow for more of The Longing. Goodbye.